Day 4, 1600 hours to 2000 hours. Darkness was falling. In the upper atmosphere, small specks were riding the air currents, falling thousands of meters, unfolding their wings and rising back up. Cracks of thunder and stabs of lightning illuminated the sky in the devilish shapes of the hunters. The storms raging across Nicaea failed to produce any rain. There seemed to be an electrical charge in the air which kept people on edge. Major Carlson had left the interrogation room for a breath of fresh air. Although brightly lit and made with the most modern building materials, the cramped cells below the Justice Police HQ were like medieval dungeons. Carlson looked at the police vehicles forming a roadblock a kilometre from the building. Surveillance equipment and crowd control units were in place to monitor all approaches to their HQ. Although this would probably prevent suicide bombers or civilian mobs, he thought it unlikely to defend them for long against the army. There were about 30 hunters hovering above the building. They seemed to be laughing and chasing each other's tails. He wondered if they were oblivious of the riots and chaos in Nicaea, or whether they were the cause of the self-destruction laying waste to the Federation. There was no news yet of his wife. He returned to the interview room. 2 young police officers had been interviewing the suspect. Man was stripped to the waist and kneeling on the floor. Chthon, a psi operative, sat in the corner of the room trying to read the prisoner's thoughts. One of the police officers saluted him. "I serve." The major returned his salute. The heat was affecting them all. The air conditioning down here barely worked at the best of times. The main power supply had cut off twice in the last hour, although only for a few seconds each time. The emergency generators were on, but they only maintained the security apparatus and the lighting. It was becoming increasingly hot and stuffy. The major picked up the photographs from the table and asked the Chthon, "Have you picked anything up?" The psi operative shook his head. "He is blocking his thoughts." The photographs were of Annalisa Sellen. Her body had been found in her conapt over 6 hours ago. She had been crucified. Her body had been spread-eagled and nailed to the floor. She had been alive when this happened, as her hands and feet had rips and tears where she had tried to pull herself free. "I've done nothing wrong. Please, let me go," Man said. He wore a red turban, had a dignified beard, and unsettling deep blue eyes. He was 50 years old, his clothes were cotton. Man was ostensibly well off. Man had been seen walking in the so-called Riotsville area of town. He had been followed and seen entering the Mikhail Gorbachev Connacht. "You were seen entering her apartment. We have fingerprints and traces of your clothing that prove you were there," the major said. The arrested man remained silent. The Justice Police records revealed that Man was a known black market dealer, but there was no information on the woman. "Why? Why?" Carlson waved the photographs in the prisoner's face. The mother of the first victim had asked the same question of the priest. "I did nothing," Man said. The major nodded to one of the officers. He didn't think there was much more he could achieve. He would report to the general on his progress. "Is he a liar?" the major asked the psi operative. "Yes," the Chthon nodded his head. "He is lying even to himself. But I cannot tell you the truth. He is not frightened, not of you. He has been trained to conceal his thoughts, to prevent his mind being read." "By whom?" "I do not know," replied the Chthon. Carlson was puzzled. It was a horrendous crime. Perhaps we are dealing with a psychopath, he thought. The intense loneliness of the journeys to the stars had upset many hitherto stable minds. There was something else about this double murder which he didn't like. Something else, something intangible which he couldn't latch on to. Deep in the bowels of the building, were the Justice Police records, their monitoring equipment, and General Copyion's office. Carlson had been ordered to report to Copyion once the interview was over. The General's own android guard patrolled the corridors. The Major was stopped, searched, and disarmed. He was then allowed into Copyion's office. Copyion was watching the vid screen on his desk. As Carlson entered, he turned it off. The Major thought his commander had visibly aged over the last 7 days. This man, who had run the Justice Police since anyone could remember, seemed to be under a terrible strain. The Justice Police had apparently done very little during the current disturbances. "I serve," Carlson saluted. Copyion remained seated. "What have you to report?" "He's not saying anything. My officers have interviewed him for over 2 hours. Copyion nodded. The Major read out a summary from the file. "The neighbours reported an argument in the apartment, a fight. Screaming, silence, and then a voice shouting, 'The days are eerie.' Even residents from this seedy downtown apartment block were disturbed enough to call the security police. We were called to investigate a crime in what is generally considered to be a no-go area of the city. The witnesses talked about inhuman screams. This isn't an ordinary killing. Have you discovered any connection between this and the other murder?" Copyion asked. "They were both women, and both victims were killed in some form of bizarre ritual. The first victim was a student, whilst the second victim was a prostitute," Carlson said. "What makes you think that?" Copyion asked. "She'd lived there only a few weeks. The neighbours say they rarely saw her. She seems to have ventured out only at night." Copyion sat back in his chair. His eyes seemed to stare. He inhabited a dark, shadowy world. "What do you think of her last words?" Copyion asked. "The days are eerie." "No." "Did you ever study Latin?" Copyion asked. Carlson shook his head. "I think we'd find her last words were in fact Deus Irae, the god of wrath." Copyion picked up a date from a little container in front of him. He put it in his mouth, chewing it slowly. The Major saluted. "Carry on the investigation," said Copyion. "I serve." Carlson turned to leave the room. As he did, Copyion signalled with his hand, as if he'd remembered something. "Your wife has returned home," Copyion said. "Sir?" Carlson was puzzled. "I didn't tell anyone that she was missing." "No?" Copyion shrugged. "I wonder how I knew." Carlson saluted his commander. He was more concerned about where his wife had been, and if she was all right, than about finding out how the General had known she was missing. Bernice sat on the side of the raft, thinking what to write in her diary. She remembered the Hans Christian Andersen stories that her father used to read to her as a child. She couldn't remember much about her father, but would always remember the feeling of being scared by the weird world of the fairy stories. As they drifted down the river, the forest looked like it might contain, away from the light of the day, the little shoemaker's cottage or the old witch's toffee house. Spike was like the woodcutter, come with his axe to chop the tree down. Her mind was wandering, back into her past. Her combat trousers became a short skirt as she stood on the river's edge, skimming stones across the surface of the water. She was giggling as she tried to beat her father by throwing the stone and hitting a rock in the middle of the river. Her mother had prepared sandwiches. This was her favourite memory. She didn't want to write in her diary. She wanted to have stayed at home with her parents as a child. Why did things have to end? Why did she have to grow up? About 20 metres from the raft, the river was starting to bubble. A shape was moving towards them. A jellyfish broke the surface with a splash and lay on top of the water. The creature was 10 metres long with a grey body and black spots. There were no signs of sensory organs. Bernice guessed that it experienced the outside world through its tentacles. The tentacles seemed to be stretching beneath the water and towards the raft. As she looked, she wondered if this was an intelligent life form or another parasitical creature surviving off the smaller marine life. It had a beautiful... The creature exploded. Parts of its body erupted in a white flash. The sound of gunfire, screams from the jellyfish. It was in great pain. A black life force was seeping out of the screeching beast. Bernice smelt burning and turned to Spike. He stood with a laser rifle over his shoulder. He blasted the creature once more. She stared at him. He was calm and indifferent to any suffering he may have caused. The creature was scattered over the river. There was no sound from it any more. "We cannot take any chances. It may have been your friend." He slung the rifle over his shoulder. "What would happen if I told you that I wasn't one of the shape changers, that you've made a mistake, and they're both still out there?" She was angry at the unnecessary slaughter. Spike smiled. "And who are you?" "My name is Bernice Summerfield. I'm an archaeologist." He obviously did not believe her. "And what are you doing here?" "I came here with my friend, the doctor." "Why?" She realized that she couldn't tell him any more. She could hardly tell him that they were time travelers who had come here to discover what was going to destroy the Nicean star system any time now. "Oh, forget it. You wouldn't believe me." Spike continued to smile at her. "And don't patronize me. I don't want to be here either." "You are trying to trick me. I laugh at your vain efforts." She sat down forcefully and found herself almost falling off the raft. Spike pushed at the branch and continued to navigate their way down the river. About an hour later, he pointed up ahead. Bernice made a show of being bored and turning ever so slowly to look. Whatever he pointed out, she was going to say, "Oh yeah, so what?" Somewhere upstream, a hue radiated out over the trees. The glow must have been 30 meters above the jungle. She wondered what caused the effect, and then realized that it was the first sign of other sentient life on the planet. This must be their destination. "So what?" she said. "I estimate that we are 2 days away, but we have just seen the end of our journey." "Oh, yeah." She lay on the raft, pretending that she was writing in her diary. The journey continued. Blake had watched the black demons flying above them and had seen them disappear. A cobbled road lay in front of them. The Baputchin, by habit or instinct, headed onto the path. The doctor seemed to be enjoying the ride. Blake hated it. It made him feel distinctly unwell. It reminded him of one night on the Thames when he had drunk a flagon of beer, borrowed a rowboat, and tried to get home on the river. It had seemed to be a good idea, but then most things do when drunk. He laughed to himself, remembering that he had dipped his face into the cold water as he tried to sober up. He had ended up going for a midnight swim. He had felt exactly like he did now the next day, but there had been the pleasure of the night before. There was no pleasure to go with this present experience. His body ached. It was not surprising. He was getting on in years. He was 54 and led a sedentary life. When he was inspired, he had to take himself away from all social life. He had to wander around, pace around the house. He couldn't explain creativity. There was a muse which visited and communicated something to him, something he had to struggle with and tell the world. There wasn't much physical exercise in being a poet and artist. His stomach rumbled. He realized that he was hungry. He liked his food. He could do with goose and boiled potatoes. How long would this journey go on for? He needed feeding. "Doctor, where are we going?" "I'm trying to find some way of us returning back to our universe." The doctor pointed in front of them. Somewhere in the distance rose a thick column of smoke. There. Do you think it's the Khan? Blake asked. I don't know, replied the doctor. He looked very serious, contemplating some thought that had entered into his mind. Let's carry on. The Bappucchin were able to move faster on the stone track. Their speed rivaled the racehorses that Blake had seen outside London. They had no problems keeping up the pace, did not tire, and didn't need to stop for water. What were you working on? The doctor asked. I don't understand. You were a poet and artist, said the doctor. What do you mean I was? Blake retorted. Yes. The doctor seemed uncertain about what to say next. Blake stared at him, appalled by his casual remark. Are you frightened of death? The doctor seemed surprised. No. Blake wasn't sure. The older he became, the more accepting he was of his eventual fate. It wouldn't be too bad a thing. He would miss people. But he believed there was something after. Death wasn't the end. There was always a small part of him which believed he was immortal, that he wouldn't die, that he would be the first person to live forever. He knew it wasn't true. And now this strange man had told him that he wouldn't continue on and on. At life's end, there would be lots of things he had never done, he thought. Company, the doctor said, pointing once again to the sky. There were 7 objects heading towards them. Were the demons returning? As they came closer, he realized that these creatures moved in a different way. They were twice the size of the demons, with huge beaks and wings larger than his house. Their outstretched claws alone were larger than the Bappucchin. Pterodactyls! The doctor shouted, as the creatures dived towards him. What are they? Blake asked. Dinosaurs. They existed on your planet millions of years before mankind. What do you mean, my planet? Blake was mystified by the traveller's incoherent conversation. Suddenly, there was an explosion. Blake fell face forward onto the ground. Another explosion! White, acrid smoke billowed around them. The doctor remained on his Bappucchin. The pterodactyl's wings were flapping dangerously close to them. Blake heard a loud bang. The ground erupted around him, spraying him with sand. He rubbed his eyes. They were stinging. He tried to look into the sky. When he did, he saw people actually riding the pterodactyls. Women! Their bodies were painted a dirty blue colour. Blake could see they were half naked and had parts of their bodies missing. Some had absent limbs, others' faces had been rearranged. And these women were throwing bombs at them. Small pots which were thrown onto the ground, smashed and then exploded. Another bomb was thrown, this time landing only feet from the doctor. An explosion. Amidst the smoke, Blake saw the traveller slipping from his mount. The doctor's head hit a stone, and he lay, not moving, on the ground. The door opened automatically. He had travelled across the city. Melanie smiled at him. She was dressed in her grey overcoat, her head covered in a similar coloured scarf. She had been packing 2 suitcases. She placed her perfumes and soaps on the luggage. She had tidied up the room. "John," she said. "What have you been doing? Where have you been? I've been worried about you," he said. "I'm leaving," she replied. "You are what?" "I've had enough. I can't cope with not knowing what you're up to," she shrugged. "I love you," he said. He walked up to her and held her shoulders. "Don't be stupid," she said, knocking his arms away. "I'm not." He didn't know what to say. "We've given it a go. We've tried," she said. "Don't go," he said. "It's too late." She shook her head. "Where are you going?" "I'll be all right. I'll be in touch." He couldn't cope with this. He needed her. She needed him. He was sure. They had been together for 4 years. She'd been a nurse. They'd met after he'd been beaten up by 2 Riotsville thugs. She had stitched his wounds. He'd asked her to come out for a drink. They'd had a good time. But he needed to drink. He had to soften the horrors of his job. The nightly scenes of violence and the dreams. He couldn't cope. They both knew he couldn't cope. But at least he had a job. They were well off. Not rich, but they survived. And he loved her. She was everything. He heard the hover taxi arrive. The taxi driver carried her cases to the car. Carlson shouted at her, begged her to stay. He said he would crack up without her. He wouldn't be able to cope. "Please stay," he shouted as the taxi disappeared down the road. The androids' movement through the vegetation was slow. The jungle around them had been decimated by the flamethrower. Ashes marked their path for over a kilometre. Caution about the location of the shape changes occasionally led them to stop suddenly in response to a half-glimpsed movement or a sound heard in the surrounding jungle. They had been trained in jungle warfare by the legendary Brian Parsons. A veteran of many of Earth's most notorious space conflicts, he had been dead for over 2 centuries. However, his methods were still programmed into the android killers. As part of their practical training, they were transported into hostile territory, where they had to survive and retrieve a chosen item. The androids that returned were classified as killers and put into action on the frontiers. Thomas remembered. He and 8 other novices were placed on a shipwrecked moon transporter in an airless world against a simulated Dalek task force. Parsons concentrated on the Najake concept. Najake was a word which didn't have an exact meaning. Parsons translated it as neither here nor there. He spoke of the enemy as constantly using trickery and of the dangers of trusting perception. Thomas still felt the dangers on this mission were more from his fellow androids than the 2 shape changes. He had considered that there might not be any shape changes, and this mission might be another training exercise. Would he and the others end up terminating each other without there being a real enemy on this planet? This would explain why his controllers had sent 4 different personalities on the same mission. It was an experiment, and they were being watched to see if they failed. "It hasn't attacked," Marilyn said, stating the obvious. "No," replied Thomas. "You know, I think it's scared of us," said Cheney. The ashes around him began to move as if caught by a strong wind. A black residue had begun to congeal around Cheney's feet, and then suddenly the ashes appeared to stand. The shape of a man stood before them. It waved its arms and laughed. Thomas and Marilyn lined their weapons up. This time they wouldn't miss. The bullets and lasers ripped into the amorphous form. Their weapons cut into the body. The ashes reassembled into the same shifting shape. The form moved over to Cheney and enveloped him. "No!" he screamed. He was struggling. It was as if he was fighting with his own shadow. Then there was no more movement, and his lifeless corpse fell to the ground. The shape turned towards the other androids. "You're next," it whispered. The ashes fell back to the earth. Thomas and Marilyn were alone, and they knew they were the hunted. The Chthons had taken over 10 hours to climb down the escarpment. The box had to be kept upright and steady. The warhead was armed, and any accident could set off an explosion the size of a star-going nova. They lowered the missile down to the plane using ropes and levers. Swarf had watched the manoeuvre, and occasionally broken into a squawk if it appeared the Chthons were mishandling the missile. Chopra felt something was growing inside him. A feeling which he couldn't explain was slowly taking possession of him. He felt sick, but it was not a virus. It was something outside of his body. He sensed one woman travelling down an expanse of water and another trapped in a small space. Both were a great distance away. He couldn't feel the presence of the androids. Butler was about 10 kilometres away, deep in the jungle. There was also a darkness on the planet. Close to the shape-changer, he felt an emptiness, the like of which he had never experienced before, throbbing and growing. "Careful!" shouted Swarf. Chopra looked up. A Chthon was falling down to the earth. He felt no surprise or pain. Life and death were mapped out. There were no accidents, no free will, only the impersonal machinations of the gods. There was a nasty thud. The body was badly broken, but there was still life. Chopra knelt over the dying man. He held his hand. Near the body, Chopra noticed a scorpion. Its stinger was swinging to and fro, as if it was about to let loose a deadly poison. The Chthon pulled himself up to Chopra's face and whispered, "They're back." His body shuddered, and he was dead. Chopra turned in panic. Bernice stirred. She had fallen asleep. Spike sat on the other side of the raft, his eyes scanning the surrounding jungle as the raft headed downriver. He looked across at her. She smiled. He looked away. She was sure she had heard something out of place which had woken her from her sleep. The sound of horses' hooves? She couldn't remember what she had been dreaming. She listened to the sounds around her. She could hear the water lapping around the raft, but no horses. It was ridiculous. The galloping horses must have been in her dream. She closed her eyes and lay back on the raft.